So how exactly does a country with pretty much zero natural resources, a tiny domestic market, and essentially constant geopolitical isolation manage to build an absolute economic miracle? I mean, it's a puzzle that completely defies standard economic logic, right? You'd expect a nation dealing with those kinds of constraints to be struggling just to keep things stable. But somehow, this very specific, high-pressure environment engineered one of the most concentrated, high-velocity technology hubs on the entire planet.
All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today we're taking a really close analytical look at a seminal piece of business literature, the 2009 book Startup Nation by Senor and Saul Singer. But, we aren't just stopping in 2009. We're going to bridge that foundational text with the radically scaled-up, hyper-complex realities of the year 2026. We're looking at what the book got totally right, what it may be oversimplified, and how a literal nation of startups evolved into this massive global powerhouse of scale-ups.
Section 1. The Startup Mystery.
To really understand where we are today, we kind of have to look back. When Startup Nation first hit the shelves, it was trying to solve a very specific mystery. There's this great quote in the book from an NBC Universal executive who asks, "Why is all this happening in Israel? I've never seen so much chaos and so much innovation all in one tiny place." And the book became incredibly influential because it actually gave a clear, comprehensive answer. It argued that this crazy high concentration of startups, R&D, and venture capital, it wasn't just a stroke of luck. It was the direct result of a highly specific, unique environment.
Section 2. An innovation ecosystem. The core thesis of the book is that all this success stems from a volatile, deeply interconnected ecosystem. And a massive pillar of that is this concept of chutzpah. The book defines it as gall, brazen nerve, and just an insatiable questioning of authority. Now, an outsider might look at that and just see a junior employee getting dangerously close to being fired for yelling at their boss. But this cultural norm, where people routinely challenge their superiors, where sergeants will literally question generals, it translates perfectly into agile software development. It creates this super flat hierarchy. Failing strategies are thrown out immediately, and businesses pivot rapidly without being paralyzed by some fear of failure.
And that culture, it's heavily reinforced by what's essentially a military-to-startup pipeline. Unlike traditional university systems that are all about theory, elite intelligence and tech units in the military, places like 8200 and Talpiot, they operate as high-trust incubators. Think about it. They are putting 19-year-olds in charge of massive, mission-critical projects. And performance and training is treated as value-neutral. Basically, as long as a risk was taken intelligently, there's something to be learned even if it fails. Then, when these folks leave the service, they bring these intense, lifelong alumni networks with them. It makes team formation and fundraising incredibly fast.
Which brings us to a really compelling observation from the source material. Gary Scheinberg, an executive at British Telecom, noted, "There is something about the DNA of Israeli innovation. I think it comes down to maturity. National Service is creating founders who have already managed million-dollar equipment and made literal life-or-death decisions. They have this level of technical and leadership maturity that is so rare in the traditional private sector. They're uniquely tested before they even think about launching a company."
Then, add to that the constraint of a tiny domestic market. Because the local consumer base is just so small, founders are basically forced to be born global. From day one, they're designing, coding, and marketing for scale in the US, Europe, or Asia. They completely skip that domestic scaling phase that companies in larger nations get comfortable in, which ensures their products are instantly ready for multinational enterprise adoption.
Section 3. The Thesis in Action. So let's look at how these cultural and structural traits actually materialized into concrete success, starting with an absolute masterclass in market creation. Before the 1990s, there was very little private venture capital there. So the government launched the YASMA program. They proactively threw down $100 million to create 10 new venture capital funds, matching local expertise with foreign capital. And the brilliant part? The government kept an equity stake, but they told the private partners they could buy them out super cheaply if the investment succeeded. They absorbed all that initial risk and basically birthed a multi-billion-dollar private VC industry overnight.
And this brilliantly illustrates the builder mentality, or Bitsoist, that the book talks about so much. We see this in leaders like Shai Agassi, who tried to completely revolutionize global electric vehicles with Better Place, or Dov Froman at Intel, who leveraged his massive network, those new Argonauts circulating between global tech hubs and home, to drive critical technological breakthroughs. It's all about impatient, resourceful execution. Now, as we'll see, the book did paint a slightly oversimplified picture by celebrating relentless startup creation while maybe overlooking the systemic growing pains that hit when those startups actually begin to scale.
Section 4.
the scale-up shift.
Fast forward to the ecosystem analyzed in the 2026 report, and wow, things have changed dramatically. The 2009 era was all about celebrating the sheer volume of new companies. The goal was often a quick, relatively low-value exit. But the 2026 reality? Vastly different. Startups aren't just looking for a quick $50 million payout anymore. The total number of new startups has actually dropped, but the capital deployed has absolutely skyrocketed. We're seeing this deliberate concentration of capital into late-stage mega rounds. Founders are using these deep pockets to hire global sales teams, buy up their competitors, and chase massive IPOs.
Now, what's really interesting is the sheer disproportionate weight of this sector. The high-tech sector employs just over a tenth of the national workforce, but that tiny, highly concentrated group, they generate a staggering 58% of all international exports. It is the absolute, undeniable engine of the entire economy.
And the scale of this maturation is probably best captured by one single number: $32 billion. In early 2026, Alphabet acquired the cloud security leader Wiz for $32 billion in cash. That is the largest pure cybersecurity deal in the history of tech. It proves this ecosystem isn't just a farm for other global companies to harvest IP from anymore. It is producing absolute corporate giants that are unilaterally defining global software standards.
Section 5. New risks and realities. But transition from a startup nation to a scale-up nation? It's exposed some severe systemic vulnerabilities. The celebratory tone has definitely given way to some pretty sobering macroeconomic pressures. Tech employment is essentially stagnated. And alarmingly, in 2025, the absolute number of domestic R&D employees actually went down. Why? Because the massive influx of multinational corporations, which is great for validating the talent pool, has driven salaries up so high that they are pricing local startups right out of their own labor market. Combine that with a strong local currency and astronomical living costs, and we're seeing significant capital flight. Companies are quietly offshoring their C-suite and R&D roles to the US and Eastern Europe.
We also have to look at a profound internal demographic challenge. The ecosystem basically operates as a dual economy, and integrating rapidly growing populations is literally an existential necessity. The 2026 report points out this fascinating paradox in the ultra-Orthodox community. Over the last decade, the number of young women entering tech surged dramatically. They are becoming the primary breadwinners and driving almost all the integration in this demographic. Meanwhile, because of educational barriers and cultural priorities, male integration has remained completely stagnant, hovering right around just 1%.
Furthermore, the resilience of the ecosystem was tested profoundly by the events of October 7, 2023. The infiltration completely shattered the reliance on highly automated, static physical barriers, what defense analysts used to call the smart wall. It brutally proved that technology without human oversight is deeply vulnerable. In response to that, the defense tech sector executed a massive, incredibly rapid pivot. Investment shifted aggressively toward the cognitive war space, a highly dynamic network of AI-driven intelligence, drone swarms, and autonomous decision-making software built specifically for asymmetric warfare.
This prolonged conflict has also introduced what analysts are calling the ticking clock of the reserves. With the prolonged mobilization of tech professionals, who, remember, heavily overlap with combat and intelligence units, early-stage lean startups are facing a severe workforce crisis. It's severely testing the operational endurance and, frankly, the psychological fabric of an ecosystem that is trying to function seamlessly while navigating daily disruptions.
Section 6. The final verdict.
So, where does all of this leave us when we look at the legacy of the 2009 book compared to the reality of today? Well, synthesizing the historical analysis with the 2026 report, the enduring lesson is pretty clear. The core DNA identified in Startup Nation remains unbroken. Innovation isn't something you can just initiate by throwing a bunch of money at a sector. It requires a highly interwoven ecosystem of culture, institutions, and high-trust networks. Constraints, whether they are geographic, demographic, or geopolitical, they aren't roadblocks. They are the exact elements that fuel creative pressure. Risk tolerance, flat hierarchies, and having global ambition from day one, those are absolutely mandatory if you want to scale.
The 2026 analysis leaves us with this really powerful verdict. The lesson is not that every country can simply copy Israel. The deeper lesson is that successful innovation ecosystems are built from human behavior, national institutions, and the ability to turn constraints into creative pressure. Look, you can't replicate a nation's unique history, its military crucible, or its existential necessities. But you absolutely can understand the systemic mechanics of how those pressures forge innovation.
Which leaves us with one final thought as we wrap up this explainer. You cannot copy another nation's history. But when you look at your own business, your own community, or your own industry, how are you going to use your unique constraints to build your own ecosystem? Think about how you can turn your biggest limitations into the exact creative pressure you need to scale. Thanks so much for joining us.